So I hope that you are having an amazing day so far. All right, so today we will be doing our grade 7 lesson on semicolons, colons, and commas. So we are going to be doing our grade 7 lesson on semicolons, colons, as well as commas. And before we start with our lesson, we are going to log into aplusstudents.ca. We're going to log in using your username as well as your password. And we're going to select Language Arts, grade 7. All right, so once we have selected grade 7, we are going to then select the chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas. All right, so in our previous lesson, we also did semicolons, colons, as well as commas. And we specifically focused on the first lesson, which is to use semicolons and commas to separate clauses. That was in our previous lesson, right? So today we are going to focus on the lesson of use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists. So under the chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas, our focus lesson is going to be to use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists. And we are doing our tutorial lesson on aplusstudents.ca. So if you do want to go back next time or anytime and you want to just follow up on the lesson, you can go to aplusstudents.ca and then go to the specific chapter, which is semicolons, colons, and commas, grade 7, and our focus lesson, which is tonight, use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists. And then later on, we're going to do our activity on commas, colons, and semicolons. We'll do our activity on aplusclasses.ca. All right, so we're going to start with a semicolon. So we use semicolons, right? So we use semicolons to separate items. We use semicolons to separate items in a series when using commas would be unclear. So if it shows that the comma is maybe unclear, that is when we use a semicolon, such as when one or more items in a series already contain commas. So if you constantly use commas all the time, then this is now when we use a semicolon to also separate items in a series where the comma is unclear. Because remember, if we have a list of things, right, then we would list our things by, for example, writing the word comma, another word comma. It's like saying, especially if we use comma, but now it says that if the comma or when the comma is unclear, right? So when the comma is unclear, then that is when we use the semicolon. So that is when we use a semicolon to separate the items because now the comma is unclear. Then we have colon, right? We use a colon to introduce a list after an independent clause. So we use a colon to introduce a list after an independent clause. And if a list does not follow an independent clause, do not use punctuation to introduce the list, meaning that you just start or you just introduce or continue the list without using any form of punctuation. And that is not often independent clause. And remember, we said an independent clause, it has a subject as well as a predicate and basically shows a complete thought. And then we have commas. And we should use commas to separate 3 or more items in a series. We also put a comma after each item in the list except for the last one. For example, if we want to list either speakers that will be speaking at whichever event, right? Then we can maybe say our speakers will be Kevin O'Malley, comma, Rachel Stein, comma, and Linda Who. And then of course it's going to be full stop. So now if we are separating 3 or more items in a series, then we put our commas. Remember, if you're only separating 2, and then you say the like it, let me just think of a name. Kevin O'Malley and Rachel Stein. That is only if we are using 2 items. But as soon as we separate 3 or more items within a series, and then we need to use a comma after each item in the list to separate these series or these items, but not the last one. The last one, we write and the person's name or whatever that we are separating. All right, so that is basically a semicolon, colon, as well as a comma. So now we're going to our tutorial page, right, on a+students.ca. And we're going to the lesson of use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists. And we are now going to expand more on what a semicolon is, colon is, as well as a comma is with lists. All right, so we use a colon to introduce a list of an independent clause. And if a list does not follow an independent clause, do not use punctuation to introduce the list. And a colon, we write a colon like this, which is dot and dot. So that is basically a colon, right? It's like dot dot under each other. So basically, we use a colon to introduce a list. We use it to introduce a list of an independent clause. But if a list does not follow an independent clause, then do not use punctuations to introduce the list. And if we look at a few examples, my parents have visited much of Western Europe. So that is our independent clause. and followed by a colon. There's our colon, dot, dot. So my parents have visited much of the Western or much of Western Europe, Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. And that is the list that was introduced. The list of places that they have visited, right? And remember, we said a colon, it introduces a list after an independent clause. So there we have our independent clause. There we have our colon, and there we have our lists. And remember, we said with the list, when you have 3 or more items, right? So when 3 or more items are being separated, that is where we put the comma. But we do not put the comma by the last one, the last word of the list. Then another example is, because remember we said that we do put a semicolon before we put the list and after the independent clause, but if a list does not follow an independent clause, we should not use the punctuation to introduce the list. And here we have an example. My parents have visited much of Western Europe. So my parents have visited much of Western Europe, including, you see there we have a comma only. And that comma is just to basically show it's like a pause, including Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. And there we have 2 examples. One where we use the colon, and that colon is put after the independent clause before we list or introduce the list. And if it does not have a list, or if the list does not have an independent clause, then we do not use punctuation to introduce the list. We use a comma to separate 3 or more items in a series. Put a comma after the items in the list except for the last one. And there we have speakers will be Kevin O'Malley, Rachel Stein, and Linda Wu. Or you can, for example, say another sentence that you can make is, my mom bought apples, pears, bananas, and grapes. And as you can see there, we have our list where there's like 3 or more items within that series. And we put a comma after each item, except for the last one. And then we have a semicolon. And semicolons, we use semicolons to separate items in a series when using commas would be unclear, such as when 1 or more items in a series already contain commas. And an example is, our speakers will be Kevin O'Malley, an English professor, Rachel Stein, a print journalist, and Linda Wu, a blogger. So if we had to basically put commas here all the time, you wouldn't really have been able to separate in this case, for example, the name of the person and the profession. So our speakers will be Kevin O'Malley, an English professor, and there we have our semicolon. Rachel Stein, comma, a print journalist, and Linda Wu, which is a blogger. There we have our semicolon and Linda Wu, which is a blogger. All right. So also when it comes to commas, no item in the series already it must when it comes to commas, right? It is basically to separate items. And of course, our emphasis on this or our focus when it comes to this lesson is to use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists. And when we list different items, we list certain things, we will always put a comma. All right. We're going to go over this one activity which is add commas, semicolons, or colons if needed. Otherwise, just submit the text without any additional punctuation. The Vision Center offers a complete range of optical services and products, including routine eye examines contact. Eye exams contact lenses, a large selection of fashionable and affordable frames, and industrial safety eyewear. So we either need to add commas or we add semicolons or colons if needed. So the Vision Center offers a complete range of optical services and products, including routine eye exam contact lenses, and there we put a comma for eye lenses, we put a comma over there. A large selection of fashionables and affordable frame and industrial safety eyewear. So that is basically our comma or punctuation mark that we add over there. Which means that if we were to check our answers, the Vision Center offers a complete range of optical services and products, including routine eye exams, yes, contact lenses, yes, and a large selection and fashionable items and affordable frames, comma, and industrial safety. Oh, we forgot to put the one comma by in front of industrial safety eyewear. Here we have another sentence where we need to either add a comma, semicolon, or we are adding a colon if needed. Otherwise, we're just going to submit the text without any additional punctuation. Mr. Mills has hiked 6 of Earth's most significant mountain ranges, the Great Diving Range. So the Great Diving Range, the Andes, the Himalayas, the Atlas Mountains, the Alps, and the Rocky Mountains. So basically, Mr. Mills has hiked 6 of Earth's most significant mountain ranges. So if we have a sentence like that, right, then it means that we are going to put the semicolon. So we put a semicolon in front of over there. So we put the semicolon, then we put the semicolon here in front of the. So which means that our sentence is going to read, Mr. Mills has hiked 6 of Earth's most significant mountain ranges. There we have a semicolon, the Great Diving Range, comma, the Andes, comma, the Himalayas, comma, the Atlas Mountains, the Alps, and lastly, the Rocky Mountains. All right. And there we already did that one. Now we're going to do the last one before we go on to our test. We're going to test ourselves to see if we are able to identify and use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists. We need to add a comma, semicolon, or colon if needed. Otherwise, we're just going to submit the text without any additional punctuations. Henry saw 5 highly poisonous snakes at the reptile sanctuary, the boomslang, the eastern tiger snake, the saw-scalped viper, the banded krait, and the king cobra. So if we look at that sentence, right, we need to either add a comma, we either add a semicolon or a colon. So Henry saw 5 highly poisonous snakes at the reptile sanctuary, the boomslang, the eastern tiger snake, the saw-scaled viper, the banded krait, and the king cobra. So if we either the comma, semicolon, or the colon, then we are going to say, we're going to choose the colon, where we're going to say Henry saw 5 highly poisonous snakes at the reptile sanctuary. Then we put our colon. Sanctuary, that is not after sanctuary. Um, So Henry saw 5 highly poisonous snakes at the reptile sanctuary. There we have our colon, right, which means that this is then an independent clause, which is Henry saw 5 highly poisonous snakes at the reptile sanctuary, colon. And now this is where we start listing the boomslang, the eastern tiger snake, the saw-scaled viper, the branded crate, and the king cobra. So there we added our colon after the independent clause. All right. So that is basically how we need to add a comma, colon, or a semicolon. And remember, we said a colon, it introduces a list of an independent clause. But if a list does not follow an independent clause, then we do not use the punctuation to introduce the list. So you're not going to put a colon to introduce the list. And then we use a comma to separate 3 or more items within a series. And we put a comma after each of these items except for the last one. And then we have the semicolon, which is the last one, which is to separate items in a series when using commas would be unclear, such as when one or more items in a series already contain commas. So we are going to now add either semicolon, we're going to add a colon or commas with our lists. Some of his famous spices include Francis Walsingham, who spied for Queen Elizabeth I, Nathan Hale, who spied during the Revolutionary War, and Bell Boyd, who gathered intelligence during the Civil War. So if we basically choose one of these options, especially where we have either a comma, semicolon, or a colon, then we need to choose one of these options. Is it option 1 or option 2? So some of history's most famous spies include Francis Walsingham, who spied for Queen Elizabeth I, Nathan Hale, who spied during the Revolutionary War, and Bell Boyd, who gathered intelligence during the Civil War? Or is it some of history's most famous spies includes Francis, who spied for Queen Elizabeth II, Nathan Hale, who spied during the Revolutionary War, and Bell Boyd, who gathered intelligence during the Civil War. So if we choose the correct commas, semicolons, or colons, right? Remember that there's like with commas, it basically just lists or it gives a list of items or it lists the items, 3 or more. Then we have a colon and a semicolon. So we're going to let's choose quickly the second one. Because there, especially where it says Walsingham was spied for Queen Elizabeth I, semicolon, Nathan Hale, and Belle Boyd. And we had to basically choose the first one, right? Which is to choose the semicolon, right? After each one. So remember, if you get anything wrong, right, what you can do is you go to where the correct answer is, you copy the link, send it to us, and you will get 100 bonus points, which means that the first answer is the one on top, the first one. An unrelenting drought. An unrelenting drought in California has drained lakes, rivers, and snowpacks. So the state now relies on groundwater to meet demand. So an unrelenting drought in California has drained lakes, rivers, and snowpacks. So the state now relies on groundwater to meet demand. So we can, I think, yeah, we need to list these items. So which means that it's going to go as number 2. An unrelenting drought in California has drained lakes, comma, rivers, and snowbanks. Oopsie, first select. Oopsie. Ooh, sorry. So here it is. I made a mistake. So if we look at this comma over here, remember this comma needs to be in front of the and. That was just my silly mistake. So remember we put when we are listing the last word, right? Then we first need to put the comma, then and. So any listing, comma first, then and. Even over here, we have a comma, then and, not the comma after and. So according to data from 2011 and earlier, some 20 to 32% of wild caught seafood imported into the United States from unregulated, illegal, and unreported pirate fishing sources. So we need to use either commas, semicolons, or colons if needed. Guys, if you do make any mistakes, then you can go to the correct, you can scroll down, look for the correct answer, select it, copy it, send it to us, and you will get 100 bonus points. Remember, we said that commas, it lists 3 or more items, right? So we put a comma after each of the items, except the last one. So if you look at this one, it says according to data from 2011 and earlier, some 20 to 30% of wild caught seafood imported into the United States was from unregulated, illegal, and unreported pirate fishing sources? Or is it according to data from 2011 and earlier, some 20 to 32% of wild caught seafood imported into the United States was from unregulated, illegal, and unreported pirate fishing. If we look at the comma here by and, the comma needs to be in front of and, such as by the first one. So the comma goes in front of and this is also listing items. So which means that we put a comma if we list. If you love literature, you would likely enjoy visiting Shakespeare and Company, a bookstore in Paris, France, Yashnaya, Polyana, Leo Tolstoy's estate in Russia, and Henry David Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. So we must now either choose commas, semicolons, or put in the colons, any of these punctuations that are correct. So we must now say if it's the first option, which is if you love literature, you would likely enjoy visiting Shakespeare and Company, a bookstore in Paris, France, Yashnaya Polyana, Leo Tolstoy's estate in Russia, and Henry David Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. So now we need to choose either that one or the bottom one, which is if you love literature, you would likely enjoy visiting Shakespeare and Company, a bookstore in Paris, France, Yashnaya Polyana, Leo Tolstoy's estate in Russia, and Henry David Thoreau's cabin in Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. So we now need to choose between one of these options. All right, so if we choose the correct option, right, then East Russia in we need to look at the specific where either the punctuations are, whether it is a comma, whether we are separating it with a comma, a semicolon, or a colon. And in this case, we said that we need to separate it with a colon, right? And we will choose, let's choose this option and see what it brings. And that is correct. All right, so that is basically, we're going to stop over there. Now, can we, before we end our lesson, let's go and do an activity. And we're going to go to A plus classes.ca. Our tutorial or our lesson we did on A plus students.ca. And now the one activity we're going to do on A plus classes.ca. So we're going to log in. We'll go to learning materials, grades, and we go to grade 7. We're going to scroll down to where it says, what would you like to do? And we're going to choose language arts. Here we have three workbooks, and we're going to choose the second workbook, which says Practice Grammar in Language Arts Workbook. And we're going to scroll down up until we get to page 45. So let's go to page 45. We're scrolling to page 45. So we will start with commas first. All right, so let's go to page 46. So yeah, this is using commas, right? So we mentioned using commas, semicolons, as well as colons. So when using a comma, right, we say use commas to separate three or more words, phrases, or clauses in a series, right? So usually if we list items and then we need to use a comma to separate three or more items within that list. For example, the market sells corn, peas, and squash, right? So the only time we don't use the comma is after the last word, because then we use a endpoint, right? Whether it's a period or whichever endpoint that fits within that sentence. And then we also have to use a comma after an introductory word, like either no, I have never tried tulips, or yes, I love tulips. We also use a comma after two or more introductory prepositional phrases. At the end of the play, the actors took a bow. So that is when we use a comma. But in this case, we specifically focused on the lists, right? All right, let's look for one where there's the list. All right, here it is, right? Look at using commas in sentences, right? By B. Write 4 sentences about an event you recently attended. Use commas according to the direction in parentheses, right? This is now where we're going to be using commas with where we are listing items within a series. So about an event you recently attended. So if we write a sentence, we can maybe say if it was let me think of an event, like maybe a concert. So we can say at the school concert they sold popcorn, cool drink, and candy floss. So that is a list of items, right? We have popcorn, cool drink, and candy floss. So that is what was sold at the concert. And that is how we also use commas to basically separate items within a series. All right, so that is basically now the end of our lesson on semicolons, colons, and commas with lists, right? And we said that with commas, we use commas to separate three or more words within a list, right, or within a series. We do not put a comma after the last word. And then when it comes to a semicolon, We use a semicolon to join parts of a compound sentence when a conjunction is not used, right? We join either long parts or parts of the long compound sentences when the main clauses contain a comma, and then we use colons where it follows a phrase with these or the following to introduce lists of items that end in a sentence. Or we use a colon after an independent sentence. All right, so that is basically the end of our lesson on semicolons, colons, and commas with lists. So thank you very much, grade 7s, for joining the class. You should have a good evening further. Goodbye.